So so in the past 2 weeks or so, I carefully watched myself and pulled together what I see myself doing. So I'll take you through a few varieties of things that how I process notes from what I read. But it comes with a couple of caveats, I would say, because none of this is, let's say, very strict nor perfect. Most of it is not a deeply entrenched routine, but it is what it is. And at least what I do with my notes is more than doing nothing with my reading. One of the effects that I see from my notes, which is interesting or very useful to me, is that it provides this ratcheting effect. Whatever I write down is still there, and if I sort of keep a sense of the status of a certain note, then I only move forward, so to speak, and that's a useful effect for me. The reason I volunteered for it was because I'm always very interested in seeing how other people do this sort of stuff, how they do their own, let's say, personal knowledge management. But I think that requires sharing how I do things as well. So this is meant as a trigger for conversation and maybe an incentive for you guys to blog about your own routines as well. Because that would allow me a peek in your mode of working too. Start sharing a screen for a bit.
Tan, if you just give, before you also start, a little bit more context about why at all you take notes. In other words, is it a major part of your work, or is it for fun? This is kind of my main thing.
I think it's sort of a natural behavior. As far as I can remember, I've been taking notes ever since, since I learned how to write in primary school. So in primary school, I had these A5-sized gray recycled paper notebooks that I would buy myself and jot down stuff. None of that still exists, but at least I remember I've been taking notes as long as I can remember. Putting that into a more useful, coherent role didn't really start until university, I would say. But ever since the late 80s, I've been interested in personal knowledge management and how do you use this stuff to learning. And as we were all locked down during the pandemic, that provided a very good opportunity to reflect a little bit more on my own processes and flows. And so that created basically a more focused review of the stuff I was doing. And it's also when this tool Obsidian emerged as what turned out to be a useful tool for me, because it takes me back to the 1990s where everything was text, and Obsidian is as well. So that's useful for me. It feels like coming home. I use note-taking for everything, basically, both my learning, my work, personal stuff, household stuff. So everything is in my notes, basically. Also because I tend to forget a lot of things that I do, so I write them down. Probably because in lots of years, I switched a lot between different contexts, different assignments. So I could easily forget organizing a national level conference because something else took top of mind right after it. And then at the end of the year, I would look back, oh yeah, I organized the conference. Oh yeah, completely forgot, but here are the notes and the pictures, so it must have happened. So that's the sort of thing. I'll start sharing my screen and then take you through. I think let's share this one because that's the desktop, the second screen at least. So now you see a drawing in front of you, I think. So what I started after volunteering to do this, I started sketching a little bit. How do I actually take notes? And I realized that there's a bunch of devices that I use, e-ink device, the Kindle, Mac, mobile, etc., that create flows of things that I read. And there's a difference. So I tend to use my Kindle for books, obviously, my Mac for web articles, and my e-ink device also to create handwritten notes. And they all sort of end up at some point in Obsidian, which is my notes tool. And then I do different things with them, and the content here is not really important. And then they result in some outputs, lists of books I've read, blog posts I write, I publish to some websites for clients. And I think what's key in this here is that I continuously try to reduce the friction on the front end here, which is how do I get stuff that I do or write into notes. And I try to reduce friction on the output side. How easy is it to push something out that I've written to someplace else? But I find that I regard the friction of actually doing something with my notes is not something I want to reduce, because that friction is the actual work. That's, the thinking and the reshuffling and the rewriting, paraphrasing. So I find I'm not after reducing friction in here. So on the input side and on the output side, dealing with friction is key. In the middle, much less so. Because that friction will always be there, because that's how you connect things up and work with stuff. So what I would like to do is take you to a few of these inputs and sort of the flow that it ends up in, or flow. Well, that suggests that it's smooth running, which is not, but but let's call it flow.
Rapid.
Yeah, rapids. Yeah, so the first one, I think, because it's the most frequent one, is how I work with reading web articles in my browser. So what I do is I whenever I come across something, either in my feed reader or clicking links in postings in my feed reader or whatever, and I want to save something, I have a markdown clipping thingy, a bookmarklet in my browser that saves it as a markdown note with the rest of my notes. And whenever I do that, I add a reason why I saved it. So I try to preserve a little bit of context of why I'm saving this article. So here in the middle, of course, the text on top is in Dutch, but right here it says the reason for me is that it gives a good overview of when AI algorithms are not doing what we think we're doing. And then at the end, I already link to something that is in my notes. And this sort of snippet of my, let's say, my motivation for saving something is what provides me context whenever I start really reading what is in the article and what I want to take out of it. So this here on top is sort of the lens that I will use later on when going through that article. Another example of the same, and this is a little bit different in what it shows. So here at the top it says, well, the article is about Jack Ma and Alibaba in China. And then here on top I say, oh, these are interesting steps by the Chinese governments against the big Chinese big tech companies. And then I connect it to the geopolitical proposition that the EU is currently developing around digitization and data. And I link to a magazine that I've been reading about the Chinese tech scene as well. And then I give myself a reading hint here, where I say I want to focus on taking notes from these, not notions. And I'll explain the difference later, and see whether there's a useful contrast with the EU proposition when it comes to digitization and data as a geopolitical factor. So this helps me, later on, my future self to understand why it was that I saved this. I have Evernote notebooks full of stuff where I saved URLs and I have no clue why I did so. So this is an important bit of information for me. No, that's the same thing. So another example. What's
Tone,
yeah.
I had a quick question.
Sure.
Just back to the pure mechanics.
Yeah.
How do you get the markdown version of your web clipping? Is that a
Yeah.
specific extension?
Yeah, it's an extension in my browser. Lots of themes. Oh, where is it? Extensions. It's this one, the Markdown loads Markdown web clipper.
Okay. Super, thank you.
So that's the one that I use, and and it's you can set a template for how it saves it. So that the motivation for me to save it is in that template, and it adds the URL, and I have a specific date format that adds it in the template, and it sets the title in a certain way. So you can template how it saves it to Markdown, and which is very useful. I have about 800 at the moment, I think, sort of these clipped articles, and but about 150 of them are my own blog posts. I've been blogging for about 20 years, and I realized that a lot of my ideas and notions about things weren't actually in my notes because I blocked them and then moved on. So I also have on my blog, I have this function of on this day in previous years, I wrote this. So every day I can look back through 20 years of the blog post that I wrote on that date. And if there's something interesting there, I've been doing that now. This is, I think, the third circle around that. I've been saving those blog posts to my own notes here whenever I think there's something in it that is still relevant to me now. And I add the motivation. So this is a list of all the blog posts that I have saved them now, but I haven't processed them now. So it's a long list. As you can see, there's about 150 out of the 800 things that I've saved. I do not always intend to, I do not intend to always process these notes into, more digested stuff. So I don't really treat it as an inbox, because then I would have this huge workload. It's a repository in its own right that I can search for additional material if I have a question, but I do pick out web pages every now and then when I have the energy for it, or whether it's logical to do that in that point in time. But I don't see it as you have 800 unread items to process, because that would be like this workload that I don't really fancy having. So now this stuff is in my notes, but it's unprocessed. Maybe an example of what I try to do when I do go through one of these clipped pages. So this is an example, mostly in Dutch because I paraphrased it. But what happens is that I would go through it and delete stuff that is not of interest. I read this for, let's say, for Surprisal, which is a mathematical unit for information density. But I tend to treat it as a let's say a qualitative component as well. If there's something in there that is surprising in the sense that it contrasts with notion that I hold, or that it's something novel, or it sparks a certain association, that's the sort of stuff that I look for. And all the things that seem a confirmation of what I already know, I just throw out, or anything that is not of current interest, I throw out. And the rest I try to paraphrase. So in this article, I've done that. So what you basically see here is that there's still the headers of the subsections of the article are still in English, because that was the original, and the rest is all in Dutch. And it starts linking out to other stuff. And it has a URL to the original at the bottom. And then at the top, I keep sort of a status indicator. So this line here is still the original motivation why I saved it. And the one in here is, oh, this is somebody else's system. Let's see if there's something in it. And then this like a status update. So I've gone through it. This is now in my own words. I brought it back to what I think is essential, but I still need to pick out of this what I really want to keep. So that's a status update. So the next time I come around to this, which might be never, but might be next week, then I will take that a step further and save it somewhere else. Then one where I did do all that processing, where my notes end up is I have several, let's say, slightly different collections. So one of them is notions, which are, let's say, conceptual notes, mostly by my own hand. And I have notes which are more factual, things to remember, and I have ideas, things that are more actionable. And they are about 200 words in length usually. So this is what is left, a short blurb like this from the article that is referenced here at the bottom, after I've done sort of the reading, deleting, paraphrasing, and then I pick something out of it, and it always needs to link back to something that I already have in my other conceptual notes. So this is about the experiments. There's a link here to cheap experiments. There's a thing about how whenever something is called a pilot project in an organization, it always means that they intend to continue it, whatever the result of the pilot. And there's something here about probes and experimental agency, I would say. So this is an old one from a long time ago that I basically imported from a previous system. But this is what I end up with. And then I delete the original article from that clippings folder because the link is still there. More recently, I've been trying to replace them with Internet Archive links so that I at least have the original source available. But I don't keep the original article in my collection. So that's web clippings. Then another major entry point is PDFs and scientific articles. Last week, I used Zotero, which is a tool to also maintain citations and that sort of thing. I don't really use that, but it's a way to collect PDFs. So this is Zotero. But last week they did an update, and now one of my key plugins doesn't work anymore. But what I was able to do until now, and until the plugin editor comes around to updating that one as well, was that if you highlight in a PDF that is stored in Zotero, highlight stuff and add comments, they had a plugin that would pull those out and put them in a markdown note, so that it would be in my Obsidian collection again. So that currently doesn't work, but I can show you how it used to work until last week. So basically you have a collection here, different folders of PDFs, scientific articles or other PDFs. If it's a scientific article, it automatically grabs all the metadata and summaries and that sort of thing, which is useful for referencing later. But if you then sort of, this one here, for instance, the European Commission Digital Rights and Principles, if I open that up and I start highlighting things and adding notes, like here, this one, where it says this is the starting point for the AI regulation in the European Union. This stuff, until last week's update, this plugin would pull into a markdown note and just pull them out and have them available. So let's see, where's the original one? Oh yeah, so now we're here, back here, so where this says here, empowered to benefit from the advantages. Then deeper down, and this is the same paragraph. It has a, it has a link back to the original PDF, so so you can jump into the original document. And this is my comment. This is the starting point for the AI regulation. Also jumping back into Zotero, into the original. So then I have this, which are my highlights and comments from reading. And I basically process that in the same way as I did earlier with the web articles, go through it, and put in my associations, links to other stuff, and at some point sort of summarize that. So again, this is in Dutch, which is not helpful for you, I realize, but this is then the stuff that I took out of it, European digital rights and principles. So I have a list of rights here that I lifted out of it, and a list of principles that you see here below. And it links back both to the Zotero PDF as well as the original annotations, because I do keep those because they're a more precise reference to something than just the URL. And these are my notes of this. And then in this case, there's some older stuff below here. In this case, I also have a separate summary of this because this is also of interest to a client. So I have a second note that basically contains the same information here when it talks about the digital rights and principles. So the previous note you saw is the same as this bit. And the reason I keep that in a separate note is because it gets automatically published to a client website straight from my Obsidian notes. So this bit here and the rights again and the principles, now they're numbered, which is an automatic thing. It's just the same thing as my previous note. And which is in this case handy because this is a very, let's say, a living document. I keep track of European legislation here, what happens, and these are currently being proposed, so they're in a constant state of flux. The latest negotiations between different stakeholders, and that way I just keep my own notes up to date, and that means that the website at the client is also automatically being kept up to date. So that's very useful to me. So that's Zotero. And PDFs. I just checked today, and I have about 1,500 to 2,000 nodes in my collection that are dealing specifically with me learning stuff, and about 10% of those connect to PDFs in Zotero. And in total, there's about 7,000 notes in here because that's all my work notes and meeting notes as well. But so about 10% link back to PDFs. So it gives you a sort of a notion of how often I do that or not. Then books, which is of course more relevant to our little club here. I struggle with nonfiction books as a reading routine, I find. So I have a very well-established fiction reading routine, which helps me read one book a week, more or less, depending on the size, of course. But I don't really read the amount of nonfiction that I would like. At some point in time, I even stopped reading nonfiction because I had nowhere to go with the thoughts and the associations that I created. It just drove me crazy to run around with all that stuff in my head. So since a few years, I at least started to try and read nonfiction semi-regularly and then keep notes about it. But again, this is not a fully established routine. But what I see myself doing is two different things. So one is writing notes down while I'm reading the book. And so this is handwritten notes or on a laptop while I'm reading. So this is an example of that. I'll talk a little bit about these top level fields later, but so this is just stuff that I wrote down. So here you see page 60, 61, and then I write something down, page 64, and chapter 4, chapter 5, and it goes like that. So these are just things that I wrote down while going through that book. And then afterwards, I go through them to add links to other stuff. And maybe split off new nodes that sort of originate here. So so here, this one, for instance, would be where it says, "We have forgot how to remember," which is about sort of memory techniques that were quite common a couple of hundred years ago, but that we don't use a lot anymore. But that's sort of, it just jumps off here. So it's a piece of the book that triggered it. Then I wrote it and I link it here. And these book notes I otherwise keep. So that's one way of creating these book notes. And then whatever is linked here is in those collections that I mentioned, the notions, the conceptual stuff, the more factual stuff, and the idea stuff. But I leave them in these book notes, and I keep the book notes. More recently, since there's now a plugin that just grabs Kindle highlights, until now I never used Kindle highlights a lot. But now there's this plugin that pulls them automatically into Obsidian. So I've started doing that. What I do more now is that when I start reading a book, I create a general note about the book, which is a template where I ask myself questions. So why do I think that this book is interesting? Why do I want to read it? And then a first scan of stuff. So what happens in different chapters. And then I start reading it, go through it. Now I lost things I need. And now I rely more on the actual annotations I make in my Kindle, because it now gets synchronized to my Obsidian notes. So these are highlights from this same book. And these are just the Kindle highlights with my comments here latched onto it. Metadata and feedback is annotation. And it links to the position in the book, so that's useful as well. And then I basically do the same thing as previously, where I use this as a jumping off point and create additional notes that either take a little bit from the book or are just an association that I had while reading the book. So might be incomplete at times, so end up doing half of it and then not the rest. It's not a strict process, because whenever I find myself getting strict with myself, it becomes a chore. So I try to avoid that and just follow my energy. So that ends up in the same type of stuff as I do with web clippings, but this time the source material stays available, where the web clippings I throw away, but except for the URL. But here I keep my original highlights and notes. So that's books. It's currently a small part, but like I said, I would like to see this grow much more. Before going to the outputs, one other thing is that I also make handwritten notes on an e-ink device. That's still a very frictionful process, because I need to attach my e-ink device through a USB cable to my laptop, so I get those notes into Zotero, for instance, because it creates PDFs, but then it's still handwritten marginalia right next to the book text, so it's useful in some way, but that doesn't really feel flowy to me yet. So I do too little of that than I had imagined when I bought the e-ink device, I would say. I do have a lot of handwritten notes as well, also historically. So I have a lot of notebooks here in the house. And what I've started doing this after talking to other people who used Obsidian a lot is scanning them. So I scan a notebook that I've written years ago. So this one is from 2013. And then I create an index that so these are the images, these are the original pages. And here it says what it was about. So I talked with a guy I know in Düsseldorf, Alex, about healthcare. And this creates an index that at least makes those handwritten notes searchable. And if there's an association I already have, then I add it to it here as well. So, and that makes it searchable within the wider collection of notes that's already here. But of course, I'm not going to attempt to transcribe or incorporate every single notebook that lives in this household. So these are all the input things and how I try to process them. Like it's a messy process, but like I said, whatever I do keep is sort of this ratcheting effect for me, which is extremely useful. And then on the output side, I create a few direct outputs from these notes within Obsidian. I write blog posts in Obsidian. This one, for instance, so this is the blog post, and I wrote a separate script, a PHP script that I can trigger on my laptop that goes through my Obsidian notes and lifts out any that starts with status draft. So here it's posted because it's online, and then it posts it to my blog and changes the status here into posted, and takes categories. I can do that to 5 different sites. So my personal blog, my company website, a company internal website, the IndieWeb community in the Netherlands, and a testing website that I keep. I can either post a post or a page. And that's a PHP script that I wrote alongside Obsidian. I ran that locally, and it just pushes it out to my blog, which I find very useful, because if I try to write a blog post on the back end of my blog, then I'm sort of distracted with all the stuff, add images, add links, do this, do that, because then you're in a content management system. But here's just the writing, and I hit a button and it goes to the blog. So that's one output. The other one was the client website that I just showed you, where I keep a set of notes that are pushed to the client website, which goes through GitHub. So that's slightly different. And then the book notes that we just saw has a similar list of fields at the top here. These and it says here list, which is current because I'm currently reading it, and a month, which when I finish it. And these fields here I use to automatically generate book lists for my of the books that I've read or the books that I'm currently reading. And again, that's a separate PHP script I run alongside Obsidian. So this is an OPML list of different lists of books currently reading, fiction I've read in this year, fiction I've read last year, and then annotation is in there. And these are just fields taken from this top section here. And the PHP script creates that. And that's helpful because it means I can just make my book notes using the template that I've defined myself, and then hit a button every now and then, and it updates the list on my website. So that reduces friction on the output side. So that's it, from inputs to outputs, messy as it is. But what I find interesting here is because these are all personal tools. So I don't try to follow let's say the flow or the suggestions that are supplied by the code of Obsidian as a tool, or I don't use plugins by others that prescribe a certain way of working. And that is because I want to follow my own work processes as they shift over time, because they're not a constant. But because I know what I want to achieve and how I tend to write things down, I know, let's say, the parameters and the process steps that are relevant in my work, and that makes it easy to turn it into code and make it personal tools. So the scripts that I'm using are relatively easy to create, but they're very hard to share because they're specifically tailored to how I do things and how I write things down. But they're relatively easy to make because I know how I work for myself, and I don't have to second guess or cover all the different options or risks because I know my own protocol, so to speak. So that's it.
Wow.
How I go through things.
Thank you very much. It's I knew you doing your own thing when you talk about writing your own PHP scripts. I'm out. That is definitely a skill set.
I used to, and I studied electronic engineering 35 years ago. I didn't finish that, but one of the things that I did pick up was programming and treating it as a personal toolkit.
Yeah.
So I would never call myself a programmer. A couple of years back, I saw a posting that says I'm sort of that I'm the home cook equivalent of a programmer. I would never work in a restaurant, but I do like cooking myself, and this is the same. I would never work as a programmer, but I do tend to treat knowledge work as artisanal work, and that means you have to care about your own tools and being able to do something with PHP, which by now is an ancient technology. I should use all kinds of hip frameworks or whatever, but I use basic PHP because that's the tool that I know.
Yeah. So there's 2 or 3 questions I have bubbling in my mind, but before I get going, let others talk. Let's start from the bottom of my list. Pratik, you've been very quiet. So any thoughts of what Tom has been talking about?
No, I mean, this was very great, Don. So thanks for this. I've also been trying to listen more and talk less, and trying to absorb instead of trying to hear my own voice. I like that you have. I the chart you made. I wonder if you could share that chart somewhere with us.
Yes, of course.
So that was my only question.
Yeah, I'll put the link in there.
Yeah, thank you. Lisa, do you have any observations, questions, thoughts other than your chat comment?
Oh, I'm still eating a little bit.
I'll come back to you if you wish. Let's jump over to Art. Art, any thoughts, questions?
It's in that link, Pratik. The image is in that link, and if you click on it, you get a bigger version.
Yeah, I felt there was a kind of tension between simplicity and complexity, and that there's kind of you were saying you don't need to kind of allow for all these options because you know what you want to do on the one hand, and yet there does seem to be quite a lot of I just feel that the processes seem more complex than I would have expected sometimes. Where you put all this stuff, all these headers and things, and that's all picked up. And
yeah, it's specifically the data fields that I put on top. I feel somewhat hesitant about that. So they're useful right now, but I'm unsure how useful they will be moving forward. When my tools change, and then you have like this residue of how you used to work inside the notes. So I'm slightly worried about that. You can also work with YAML front matter in Obsidian, which is like the same metadata, but then as a separate block. I do not do that because it's sort of ignored if you use other viewers on the same text. So I use inline data fields. And the only reason they're now on top is because of my limited programming skills. I don't want to search for those data fields inside the text, so I put them on top so I know where they are. Because then I can simply read the first 14 lines of a book note and I know exactly what is in there. In other notes, I use them inline. So if it's about tasks or notes that I want to make, I use them inline. And that feels way more natural because then it just is my normal text. And at some point, I add a little marker that has a meaning now, but if it doesn't have a meaning 5 years from now, it does not disturb the meaning of the node itself. So, but these data fields on the front, I feel ambivalent about them in the sense that I know that they will not be future-proof, but they're useful right now. Yeah.
Sure. Cool, Mike.
Steve, any thoughts, comments, observations?
Yeah, what I found, two things I particularly found interesting were the idea of putting together a diagram of how you pull together your notes, which is something I'm going to have a little think about. Trying to drive how I do it, because I've got a suspicion it's perhaps a bit too complicated and a bit manual and kludgy. But that idea appeals to me because I think when we come to Tinderbox, you probably see I'm a visual person in terms of how I like things to relate to each other. The other one was just seeing Obsidian in the real world, because at the moment it does seem to be the new hotness, and it's interesting just seeing how somebody uses it and applies it.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that there's now just all of a sudden this new family of tools that you know, like Obsidian, and there's Roam, and there's Logsec, and there's Foam, and so a whole bunch of them right now, which I find interesting. And what I like about this one is that it positions itself just as a viewer on top of regular text files on my file system. So it doesn't keep them in a separate database, which has accessibility issues if you happen to lose access to the tool or whatever. So these are just all files that live in my file system, and the tool is a viewer on it, which appeals to me. And like I said at the start, it feels like going back to the 1990s when I also only had text files, and I still have a lot of text files from the 1990s, and all of a sudden I can reuse them here, even though they don't contain links to other ones. So that appeals to me, also because I know in a couple of years Obsidian will be gone, something else will take its place or not. You know, through the years I've iterated to so much. I've used Tinderbox a lot, but you know, it was too complex to me to actually have a sense that I actually used it to a meaningful percentage of its potential. You know, so Tinderbox can do so much, and I'm less a visual person and much more a text person. So this fits better with me, but yeah. So it's that's interesting. Yeah, and the reason I started making the diagram was because, as you said, I had no clue specifically what I was doing. So I thought maybe start mapping it out after I heard myself promise to discuss it here.
Yes, and I mapped my own flows out some time ago, not in Excalibur, but I thought, because again, I'm a visual person, I did publish it, but Steve, I hear you. My God, it's complicated. So I've been trying to simplify that down.
Yeah.
So
what I do note, maybe as an aside, and going back to what Art said before, what I do note is that my basic set of information strategies, how I collect stuff and what I do with it, I wrote that down in detail 20 years ago, and that has not fundamentally changed. So that's still constant. It's just that the tools have changed, and therefore the specific flows that you can create between those tools. But the way that I approach collecting and using and information and learning from it has not changed in 20 years. That's something that I did conclude after this little exercise.
The strategy is consistent. The tactics might vary.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. So we'll come back to Lisa in a moment and give her time to sort of finish off. But I'm kind of jumped on the Obsidian bandwagon myself. I think this is the first Obsidian demo I've ever seen that didn't show the beautiful graph that everybody jumps up and down about. And I thought that was really good, so that you don't.
I do use the graph though.
But it's.
I use the graph when I write.
Yes.
And then I set it to show me nodes that are 2 steps out.
Yeah.
Because the one step is whatever you link to, and then 2 steps is what they link to, and that helps me associate or try to link to, whenever I write a node, I try to link to something that is conceptually at a higher level and conceptually at a more practical level. so that you always have like this a combination of three. And the graph view set to 2 steps help me identify more easily what those nodes might be. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
but other than that, it's just a beautiful picture.
It is, yes, it's definitely see it. So do you have any thoughts on tags versus vaults versus folders in terms of how you organize your Obsidian? Since everybody in Obsidian seems to have that one way or the other.
Yeah. Tags versus categories versus folders is, of course, the age-old personal knowledge management discussion. As you can see, I use folders a lot, but they're all mutually exclusive by nature, of course. And well, this one, for instance, is my company's work, which is organized quite hierarchically because it has projects and stuff. And then this one is my conceptual folder, which I call Notions. And this is just a long list. There's no structure in here. Because this one is more networked in character, because you link from node to node. There's no preconceived structure. There's only the structure that you weave over time. And so this is a networked folder in that sense. So and the rest is, this is my family, it's the house, other interests, learning, an association I'm a board member of, another one. So that's more like mutually exclusive structure. So that's folders. And then categories and tags. I'm a big fan of tags in the sense that I use them as navigation pivots.
Yeah.
And like I said up front, I don't want to be strict with myself, and tags fit that very well where categories don't.
Yeah.
And I use tags, I think, in very specific ways. So whenever I re-find something in here, I tend to tag it with what I was searching for when I found it, so that the next time around, when I search with similar terms, there's a higher probability that I will re-find it. So that way, the tags are an echo of my current use of terms instead of just the historical use of terms. And I used, back when Delicious was still a bookmarking tool, and it had this social aspect where you could not just see that others had bookmarked it, but also what tags they used. I looked for the tags that were furthest away from my own choice of tags, because that constitutes a difference in language, and this distance says something about how far away the communities of this person are. And if we share the same interest because we bookmark the same stuff, but we use an entirely different language in doing so, then it might be interesting to actually try and bridge that social distance and look in that person's community, see if I could learn anything there, because there's a content overlap, but there's a social distance. So I used the difference in language to find other groups that had similar interests, but were operating in an entirely different context. And tags were very good for that.
Yeah, interesting. I got one more question, but I'm delighted to see you use the nomenclature Z- to keep all that CRUD stuff at the bottom. I've been doing that.
Yeah, actually, those are the ones that so templates, but the other two are the client websites that I.
So don't mess.
And I want to keep them at the bottom so I don't accidentally start changing notes there, because that will work into their sites.
So one final question from me. You mentioned the idea of bringing old posts, your history, if you will, into it and sort of indexing it. So I've been busily archiving tons of old sites I've got all over the place into one single place, which is a Blot site. And Blot, of course, just talks to a Dropbox folder, much the same way as Obsidian could. Have you thought about, I've been thinking about whether to point Obsidian at it or not. I've not done it. So any experiments there that you've done?
Yeah, I left Evernote behind a year or so ago, after having used it for a decade. So then the key question was, what do I do with those Evernote notebooks? Do I completely move them into my next version of my tools, in this case Obsidian, or or do I keep them separate? And I went through a couple of them, Evernote notebooks, and realized, well, I don't want to just import the entire thing, because that will muck up my search in my current stuff. But I do want to have it available and searchable, so that I can go back and pull out the stuff that might be of interest right now. And that's what I do. So I have my Evernote notebooks in DeafnThink and in Joplin, because Joplin can transform them into Markdown. I search there regularly and then bring over whatever I need. My blog is slightly different. It's always been in the same place. So it's one corpus.
Yep.
20 years of blog posts, and so that's a good enough repository in and of itself. And I daily check whatever I've written on that day in the years previous to see if there's something that I may want to incorporate now.
Yeah,
that's good enough for me.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Lisa, welcome back. Hope dinner was good.
Delicious.
Yeah. So you're last up.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, Ton, this was really interesting, and I'm a heavy Obsidian user, and so it was very interesting to see the way you're using it. I use it more in a project management context.
Mm-hmm.
But this one on note taking,
I do that too, but that's a separate part from this.
They're just different. But I think what I am really struck by and am taking away is your intentionality. And I mean, that shows up in a few different ways. The fact that your method has been the same essentially for 20 years. I think you had a good method 20 years ago, and it's still good. And for those of us who tend to fiddle with our methods, it's just a good reminder that, if you got something that works, you need to fiddle with it, even though your tool has changed. Your tools have changed over that time.
Tool set will change multiple times over time.
Which is also, another reason why we like Obsidian and the Markdown files. It's kind of future proof. But the other piece of intentionality that I really liked, and I'm definitely going to take away, is that in your template, basically your note-taking template includes a spot for you to say, why is this meaningful? Why am I copying this? And then even beyond, why am I putting it in here? Then going on to the actually more important part of what is the meaning of this. And I think those are, the first step is pretty easy, just to add a little note. Why did I put this in my database? And then the second part is where the magic really has a potential to happen. So thank you so much for showing that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Very cool. Agreed. So thank you all. Thank you, Ton, very much. Really interesting. Got my mind a buzzing, and I realized just what a loser I am, but I'm going to get better.
I had the opportunity now to put it all into a nice, smooth narrative, but of course, reality is quite messy.
It's like all stories; they sound really great, but the reality
you have to build this story arc,
Yeah. So, Steve, Tinderbox.
Yes. Right. Before I start sharing, I think I should probably talk about note-taking too. I think I have come to a point where my note-taking on books is mirroring something I've done for years at work, which is keeping good logbooks where I write things down, and I found that taking good notes doesn't always need one to go back and read those notes, but that intentionality or mindfulness when you're creating those notes just helps you remember and helps you recall things much more. So I think I have two flavors of notes. I have notes that I write and may never come back to, and I have notes that perhaps I work with, and that's where tools like Bear or DeafnThink I find particularly useful. So if I start to share, don't know how this will work. I don't think in the last 2 years, I don't think I've ever presented through Zoom.
There you go.
Excellent.
Happy to introduce new experiences to you, Steve.
Yes.
Mm.
So probably like many people, I'm a big fan of just taking quick linear notes in a tool like Bear. Just here's my current reading list for this year. And for some of these, I might just spin off, you know, a linked note with other information. So that's relatively simple notes that I may not refer back to. But for Tinderbox, what I thought I'd do is initially just assume that Tinderbox is new to people, so just start with a very, very basic, and then switch to an example that illustrates some of the features of Tinderbox. So what I thought I will do is that here is the start of a Tinderbox, and it's very Spartan, and there's hardly anything in there at all. A bit of guidance when you start it up on how to create a Tinderbox. There's what's called a map on one side and an outline on the other. And creating a note in Tinderbox is as simple as hitting return or double clicking the desktop, and we've created a note. And that it just looks like that. And you can go in and add some text, and that's a basic note. And I'm going to try and just squeeze this over to one side so I can see that. So within Tinderbox Notes, you can add attributes, and there's a great long list of attributes under things like people, or references, places. I'm just going to type one in, and I'm going to go for authors, which is a nice built-in attribute. And you can see here, authors is now available in the note. And I'm going to create one that doesn't currently exist, called genre. And now it'll ask me, do you want to create this new attribute? And I'll just make it a string for the moment. So we now have a note, and we'll give it authors, and we'll give it, a genre, so let's say science. And that's the start of notes, and then you can second book. And as you drag these around, you'll see there are little guides appear on the screen to help you line things up if you're so inclined. And again, you can add authors, you can add genre, and let's see.
You're clearly a fan of comedy.
And we're just building up some notes. And some of this, you could create a little map of notes here, and it gets quite busy, and then we'll do another one. And what I'll do this time is I won't bother adding that information, because I will create my first prototype. So prototypes they're just another note, but if we go into this inspector here, I have to say that Tinderbox is not the best app for discoverability of features. When I opened up one of my old ones, I had to spend quite a bit of time trying to make it work. But what I've done is I've said this note is a prototype. And I will get info. Let's give it a, let's just make it slightly different appearance. So we'll take our prototype and again, we'll add authors, genre as before, and now, so my third book was didn't have that information that we've added elsewhere, but by saying I want to use a prototype for this note, it will now include all that information by default. And just including made up names, aren't I? And let's say that's again science as the genre, and we'll come to that. So we've now got 3 books. And if we create a different note, again, they all look the same. Right. So I've now gone into a note. Remember, this one was called My First Container. So we'll take that and we'll create. Okay, so what's interesting now is to switch over to the outline view, because what we've done by creating all these notes is we've actually been creating an outline, a hierarchy of notes here. So we've got our first set of notes are all at the top level, and the container is a hierarchy with books within it, or notes within it. And one of the things that you can do in Tinderbox is you can create links between notes to say, okay, my 5th book is an example of something that's in my 4th book. So you're starting to create a map, a visual map between notes here. And there's my first container. And within that, you can actually see that the other books exist within that container. So we're just creating a basic little network of notes, and then I'm not going to go much further than creating what is called an adornment. And an adornment is not give it a nice color. So again, as we drag this around. So an adornment is just, excuse the bad spelling, it's just, it could just be a decorative thing that you use to visually group things, but some of the power of Tinderbox comes in that you can create. By the way, I should say that this inspector here that you can bring up has tabs that act on basically the whole of document. These ones here or on specific items. So this one is related to the adornment, whereas some of these are to the whole document. But what's really interesting here is, and I find very useful, is you can create queries or actions that will search the database and start to pull in information. So if you remember, I created, I think, 2 books that were genre science. So it's found genre. And so genre contains if this is because of my keyboard, I think I'll just type. So genre contains I don't know why that is disappearing.
That was a typo you put in. It was contains you wrote.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's disappearing anyway. It's weird.
Very odd. Right. I'm going to park that.
Yeah.
But
It's
what,
too bad because it's so cool when things jump into the adornment. It's
well, essentially, yeah, it will. What will happen is it will pull any notes that are the genre science inside the adornment automatically. So it acts on all the other notes and runs as a query in the background and pulls all of these things in. So what I thought I would do is towards the end here, just switch to a real example, which uses some of these features here. And this is, so my wife and I have been in a book group for quite a few years now, and I've created a set of notes from that group that use some of these features. So if we have a look at 2020, we have an adornment there that will pull in all the notes that contain 2020. So each note has a field with the date of when we met to discuss the book. So those adornments will automatically pull in those notes. And I've created, in my own head, I'm interested in how some of these books, how they prompt me to follow up with different books. So for instance, from reading the memoirs of a brain surgeon, that led to me reading a follow-up book from a different brain surgeon, which was really interesting and prompted by discussions around the aspects of that work. And then you'll notice here that some of the notes, like here, are Halloween special from 2020, a collection of very good ghost stories, have a slightly different appearance, and that's done automatically through what's called an agent here. And what this agent is doing is basically gathering, in the same way that an adornment gathers notes, this agent is pulling together all of the books that were chosen by my wife and myself into a separate list. So if we look at the information inspector for that agent, what it's doing is looking for a particular string in the hosts and creating this table automatically. And it's also applying an action to the notes. So where we're the hosts, it's automatically changing the color to one called Poppy and adding a badge to the corner of each note. So if I were to go into this note, what will happen is eventually, some of these searches tend to run over a few seconds rather than instantaneously. That note will change color and get badged appropriately, or should change color. As you can see, it's been automatically badged, and it's now been pulled into the list as well without having to do anything there. I don't know why my keyboard's playing up. Anyway. Eventually that'll go away again. And then I just use some of the things we talked about elsewhere. Container, I find it useful to have a list of all the books that were read before we joined. And I occasionally throw in possible thoughts on future books again into a container within that. And then, like we had with the little example, there's a book prototype that sets the style of all the individual books. And then finally, if you're more of a sort of text list based person, you can create a reasonably structured outline, again grouped by year, with that some of that information that was added by agents and queries included in the lists as well. So that's very much a quick tour of Tinderbox.
Yeah, but it's nice because it's really understandable. And I say this as somebody, I use Tinderbox for one thing only,
Right.
but it's so good at that one thing, even though I only need that one thing like twice a year. I pay like $100
Yes.
a year
Yeah.
for it. But I like this because this example is so understandable, and you're doing things I'm not doing. I'm like, oh, right, I forgot you could do that. Yeah, thank you.
Steve, can you share this? So when you take your book club, this obviously you can see, but can you share this in some way onto the web or others or document?
You could potentially export this as a website.
Yeah.
I know that I think the Tinderbox help pages are built using Tinderbox.
Yeah.
And that guy at Jack on Microblog,
Yes.
he's using Tinderbox to publish at least some of his blogs. I think he has like half a dozen different blogs. But one of his blogs is powered by Tinderbox.
Yes. There are, I think, 3 people on Microblog who I have had brushes with about Tinderbox in the past, and they all said how fantastic it was, and it took me a lot of convincing, but Jack was one of them. BSAG, but she's a girl, and Helge Goodmanson are all big fans of Tinderbox.
Yeah, boy, it's such a learning curve though.
Oh, yes, very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
I started using Tinderbox a very long time ago because I met Mark Bernstein at a blogging conference. I think that was 2004 or something. And he created this as a HTML as a hypertext writing tool. So he wanted to write prose, I wanted to do so in hypertext, and so that's why you can also export it to HTML and stuff. And and I saw him work with that, and I was sold on the sheer magic of what. And like you, I've been paying $100 a year, and ever since. And but I feel like I hardly scratched the surface of what Tinderbox could do. And over time, I realized that it's a great tool, but I found it hard to connect it to other tools that I also work with. So I linked from Tinderbox to Evernote and tasks and things, and that worked. but then I got confused by what agents do again, and and
Yeah.
so
I think,
it
Mark,
remains very hard for me to work smoothly
Yeah.
with it.
and he talks about it like a Swiss Army knife,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I disagree. I think you have to have a very well-defined use. I think,
yeah,
I mean, I think Obsidian is a Swiss Army knife. Like you can use it in all kinds of different ways, and it's got the saw, it's got the scissors, it's got the knife, whatever.
It's a Swiss Army knife, like the CERN in Switzerland, in Geneva. It's a Swiss Army knife for physics. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think with
And it is-
Tinderbox, you really have to have you have to have a body of data, and you want to be able to slice it in different ways where you don't necessarily know what's going to show up. And it has to be important enough that you're willing to put the time into building it.
So there's
I have
no,
to say, I have
import-
just used it for planning as well, for pulling together a plan of how things relate to each other. Really simple, just using links between things as almost as a mind map. It's a very expensive mind map, but it works beautifully for that.
Yeah, that's how I've used it most fruitfully as well. Just dump stuff first in as a unstructured mind map. Regular mind mapping tools I hate, because in the end they're also always creating hierarchical structures, because they start from a center and then branch out, and that's not how my head works. So Tinderbox allows you to move things around, then draw the connections, and then has this handy feature that you can switch the view and then have an outline. And that's been useful to me in the past.
I will also say, when I use Tinderbox, I am constantly saving versions, because I have so often had the experience that I did something and completely destroyed everything I had already done. And so, like, it's like the old days with Microsoft Word. It's like, whenever I've done more than 5 minutes of work, I save a backup, so I can always, back it up, as though it was for my own version control.
Yeah, it's not a tool that is intuitive. And I think that the more time you spend in it, the better. And I probably don't spend enough time in it, but I do find it really useful for some particular problems. And I find being able to switch from that graphical view of how things relate to a flat text view, really useful.
Yeah, or even a tree map, or so that's really useful.
And even with your little book club example, it must be really easy to add a new book, because as soon as you put in the date, it's going to show up in the right year. As soon as you add a host, it's going to show up under the right hosts. It's like, all you have to do is make the note, apply the prototype, fill in the fields, and everything else happens automatically.
Yeah.
Interesting. Steve, thank you. That was really good. I'd never even heard about Tinderbox until last session, so very educational from this perspective. So much appreciated. Thank you. As the end of the agenda as it stands, we're also sort of pushing towards sort of an hour and a half at this point, so that seems to be the length of time. So what do we want to talk about next time? Because this time's agenda sprung out of the fact that we ran out of time on the first time. So are the things that we'd now like to explore, and we'll start doing a reach out to people who would like to come and talk to us? No. Well, that's it, Jen.
I'm thinking.
Note taking done.
No, there's one thing that I want to these all tools are great, and you have been using these tools for years. As someone who is new, or someone who wants to try a new tool to use, how much time should you invest, or what should you look for before you decide to switch tools? I know we started with drafts, then we moved to some other tool. Like I like to say on my intro blog, what's new this month? And then everyone runs to that new shiny tool. And it's good to have options, but this and even maybe, as I think Jack ended once, I think he likes to try out new things, and that keeps him happy. And I think I am also somewhat like that. But at some point, I want to like invest time, and like Don or Steve have a lot of expertise. You don't go deep into one tool and have a lot of stuff in one tool. That tool may go away, but it also will teach you certain things to do, the way you do your notes, the way you group your notes. That can be always shifted to more newer tools, right? So I don't know what I'm trying to ask here, but like, so yeah, that is more of a thought than a question, but.
Yeah, I think it's always sort of a balancing act, because I suffer from shiny new tool syndrome just like everybody else. So I do like exploring new tools. I think what helps me is that a long time ago, as I mentioned, I spent quite a lot of time simply thinking about how I was actually taking in information and what I was doing with it. And ever since then, I had this mental image of how I work. And then encountering a new tool became, does this fit with how I work? And of course, it never fits completely. So then you adapt a little bit how you work so that you can make better use of the tool. But it does filter out immediately all the tools that definitely do not work for me. And but nonetheless, it's hardly a week goes by with me without me installing a new tool to just have a look out of curiosity. That's just a fact of life. I've come to accept. But in the end, my tools have been quite stable ultimately. So I've been in Evernote for a decade. Then I ran my own wiki on my laptop 5 or 6 years before that. And before that, I was 6 years in something that was called The Brain, which was still exists. It seems, it still looks like it's a tool from the late 1990s as it is. And so in the end, it was quite stable. But on top of that, I've been playing around
another
with
very
tools
expensive
forever.
application.
Yeah, right now it is. Yeah. Back then it wasn't.
I think the important thing for me is not avoid the risk of going down a dead end where your data is locked away in someone else's system. Is very important for me.
Yeah.
I was actually asked a question by somebody in my extended family a couple of days ago and had to fire up a record of my old Cyan organizer diaries, which I was astonished to find I'd taken the trouble to export to HTML at some point in the early noughties, and that's paid me back, just being able to keep that record. So I think things that are plain text, things that are perhaps export to PDF robustly, are supportable in the future and won't lock you in. And yeah, it's hard to resist the next shiny thing. I've been trying to resist craft notes for probably the last 6 months.
Yeah, and I have to say, when I see John's agendas, I'm like, oh, they look so pretty.
I know.
Oh, couldn't I do that?
Yes.
That's the visual side of me, right? So I get very, very attracted into that. It's like there's a note I shared into Microblog a while back from somebody talking about note taking and kind of reiterating what you've all just been saying, which is keep it simple. Text will always be there, not like proprietary note formats. And I 100% agree except I have so much material sitting in Pages and Keynote because I like the visual appearance of it. And I know I'm a little bit locked, but I'm stuck.
So I do have to run, but I do,
Yep.
if there's no other ideas for
Yep.
a next meeting, what would interest me is for each person to bring at least one book, possibly two, like at least, one nonfiction book you read recently and why is it interesting? And maybe bring a nonfiction and a fiction. And if we have time, we would do 2 rounds, one for nonfiction and one for fiction. But again, I'm not wedded. I'm not wedded to it.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it's not the
But
same
if
book.
we're not
right?
all
So,
reading the
yeah.
same book, I mean, this is where it's different. It's like it's a discovery channel. Maybe every 3 or 4 times we do a discovery channel.
So it's not apps, it's books that we'll find and continue, right?
Right. And I'm happy to be overruled if there's another idea, but I would like to keep meeting. I
I
enjoy
think
these.
that's a great idea.
Yeah, I do as well.
Same,
So
yep.
Yeah.
That's
put
one.
that down. And the people in the meeting are the ones that should get the vote. I mean, it's all very well been on the list, but if you don't turn up, then why should we talk about what you're interested in?
And are we meeting on, is it May 1st?
So
That we're
I was
meeting?
about to ask actually when we think. I would suggest a little bit later than that, just because I don't really know why. But
No, actually, for me, May Day is an important day for several
Yeah.
reasons. I have friends who have who are Morris dancers, if anybody knows what that is.
I do.
Yes.
So we
Oh,
all dance the sun up at
Okay.
sunrise. So May 8th would be better, though that's Mother's Day in the US. That's not a problem for me, but
So shall we jump another week then to the 15th, 16th?
is the 8th the problem for anyone?
I was just thinking about Mother's Day when you said that.
Well, I guess there's people who are not here. Yeah. So maybe we should go out to the 15th.
Yeah. So let's say 15th, 16th. That gives a bit of air as well to actually find those books and read them and understand why we want to recommend them. Excellent. Okay, so that sounds like a great topic to me, and it sounds like we got good support from within the group. So 15th, 16th will be when it goes. We won't have top changes, so that'll be sorted. We will start an hour earlier, so that's all good. And we've got a topic. So hey, we're rolling here. We're rolling.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Tom, Steve, thank you both very much for everything that you did for preparing today, and everybody
Yes.
else, all the inputs.
Yes,
I've recorded it as
Thanks,
well,
Steve.
just so I normally do it. I forgot to announce that at the beginning, but it will be there for other people to check into. So thank you all very much, and let's bring this show to an end.
Great.
Thank you,
And
John.
thanks,
for
John,
being
for
with us.
See
hosting.
everyone.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much all.
Well, bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.